Nobody warned me that people would start treating me like a financial burden before the flowers from my husband's funeral had even wilted. But I should have seen it coming. Snow drifted heavily across the windows of Aspen Ridge Lodge while guests in dark winter coats gathered beneath the antler chandeliers, speaking in those soft, careful voices people use around fresh grief. Harold built that mountain lodge 40 years ago with his own hands before ski tourists and luxury developers turned Aspen into something polished and expensive. To me, it still smelled like cedarwood smoke and coffee at 6 in the morning. To everyone else, that evening it looked like valuable real estate. I stayed near the stone fireplace holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold, while Vanessa moved gracefully through the room, greeting investors and old family friends like she was hosting a charity gala instead of a memorial reception. Honestly, she whispered quietly beside the staircase to a woman from the country club, I do not know how Eleanor plans to keep this place running now. The woman glanced toward me with polite sympathy before lowering her voice. Maybe selling would take pressure off her. Selling. Such a clean little word for erasing someone's entire life. I pretended not to hear because grief already sat heavy enough in my chest without adding humiliation to it. Across the room, Daniel stood beside a banker near the lodge windows, discussing financing while snow piled against the glass outside. Once ownership transitions are finalized, the banker said, we can revisit the expansion package. Harold hated debt. He believed mountain businesses survive through patience and loyalty, not oversized ambition. Yet Daniel nodded carefully, like these conversations had been happening long before the funeral. Later that night, I walked upstairs toward Harold's office, wanting 5 quiet minutes alone beside his leather chair and old fishing photographs. But the keypad beside the office door flashed red after I entered the code. Invalid entry. I tried again slower. Same result. Then I heard Vanessa behind me holding folded table linens against her chest. Oh, she said quickly. Daniel updated the security system yesterday while organizing financial records. Organizing financial records. Another gentle phrase hiding something colder underneath. Then she looked directly at me and added softly, there are probably things about the finances Harold never wanted you to worry about. Nobody warned me that grief could make people study your grocery cart like it was a financial statement. But I should have seen it coming. 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, I stood at the checkout line inside Miller's Market, holding a stack of coupons clipped from the Sunday paper, while Claire stared at them like I had embarrassed her personally. She shifted her designer handbag higher onto her shoulder and lowered her voice. Margaret, you really do not need to do that in public. I looked down at the coupons in my hand. 40 cents off soup. Buy one, get one free pasta. The same things I had used for nearly 40 years while Richard built Ellis Transportation one truck at a time. Saving money is not shameful, I said quietly. Claire forced a smile at the cashier. Of course not, but her cheeks tightened. Outside the store, snow blew sideways across the parking lot while she loaded expensive shopping bags into the back of her white Range Rover. I carried my own groceries carefully because one paper bag had started tearing near the bottom. Claire watched me struggle for a second before sighing impatiently. You could let Daniel help with your bills now. You should not worry about things like this anymore. Something in the way she said help made my stomach turn cold. Not kindness. Management. Ownership. When we reached my house, Daniel's black Mercedes was already in the driveway beside a delivery van from Ellis Transportation. Through the living room window, I saw boxes stacked near Richard's old office. What is going on? I asked. Claire adjusted her gloves slowly before answering. Daniel thought it might be easier if we started organizing paperwork now instead of later. I stepped inside and immediately noticed Richard's locked filing cabinet standing open for the first time in years. And Daniel was holding a key I had never seen before. Daniel looked up too quickly when he saw me standing in the doorway. For a second the room went silent except for the ticking grandfather clock near Richard's office. Open folders covered the dining table beside legal envelopes and yellow sticky notes written in Claire's neat handwriting. My husband had hated sticky notes. He used legal pads for everything. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, sliding one drawer shut with his knee. "We were just trying to organize things before tax season." I set my groceries on the kitchen counter slowly. One can of soup rolled sideways inside the paper bag before settling against the bread loaf. "Richard never liked people touching his office," I said. Claire crossed her arms, but kept her tone polite. "Some of these documents affect the company directly. Investors are already asking questions." Investors? The words sounded strange inside my house before Christmas decorations had even come down. I walked toward the office and noticed Richard's old leather chair slightly turned toward the window, like someone had been sitting there recently. The faint smell of Daniel's cologne lingered in the room. My eyes moved toward the filing cabinet. Several folders now sat stacked neatly beside it, labeled shipping contracts and share distribution. Daniel stepped between me and the desk almost instinctively. "You do not need to worry about any of this right now." I studied his face quietly. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Tiny red veins showed beneath his eyes the same way Richard's had during difficult years at the company. But Richard never hid paperwork for me. "I helped build that business too," I said softly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Nobody is saying you did not." Claire picked up one of the folders carefully. "We are only trying to protect what Dad left behind." Her words sounded rehearsed. Then my eyes landed on something half hidden beneath the desk lamp. A folded marina brochure from Newport Harbor Club. Richard had never liked yachts or private clubs. But Daniel and Claire had visited Newport twice that summer. I reached for the brochure slowly. Claire's expression changed instantly. And that was the moment I realized they were hiding something much bigger than unpaid bills. That night after Daniel and Claire left, I sat alone in Richard's office with only the desk lamp glowing beside me. Snow pressed softly against the windows while the old radiator clicked beneath framed photographs from Ellis Transportation's early years. Richard standing beside his first truck in 1983. Daniel as a teenager helping unload freight during summer break. Back then we celebrated with hamburgers and paper plates whenever the company survived another difficult quarter. I opened the marina brochure again slowly. Newport Harbor Club. Private investment presentation. Exclusive ownership opportunities. Tucked inside the fold sat a business card with Claire's handwriting across the back. Lunch with Grant Mercer. Follow up about expansion capital. My stomach tightened. Richard hated debt. He said borrowed money made people behave like gamblers pretending to be businessmen. The next morning, I drove to Ellis Transportation headquarters for the first time since the funeral. Several employees looked surprised when I walked through the lobby. One older dispatcher named Leon immediately stood from behind his desk. "Mrs. Ellis," he said warmly. "Good seeing you back." His expression softened after that. "Richard always said you remembered everybody's names." I smiled faintly. I still do. Upstairs, the executive offices felt colder than I remembered. New furniture. Expensive abstract artwork. Claire's influence was everywhere now. Through the glass conference room walls, I spotted Daniel arguing quietly with a man in a charcoal overcoat I had never seen before. The stranger carried thick folders marked refinancing proposal across the front. Daniel noticed me first. His face changed instantly. "Mom," he said quickly once he stepped into the hallway. "You should have called first." The sentence landed harder than he probably intended. "Not welcome. Not included." I glanced past him toward the conference room. "Who is Grant Mercer?" Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. Before he could answer, the man himself appeared beside the doorway, extending his hand smoothly. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "I have heard so much about you." His smile never reached his eyes. Then I noticed something sitting inside the conference room, beside the financial reports and coffee cups. Richard's original shareholder ledger. The one Daniel told me had disappeared after the funeral. I looked directly at the shareholder ledger without touching it. Richard protected that book more carefully than our wedding album. Every ownership percentage. Every transfer. Every emergency agreement from the company's earliest years sat inside those pages, written partly in Richard's handwriting and partly in mine. Grant Mercer noticed my attention immediately and closed the ledger halfway with one smooth motion. "Private material," he said politely. Daniel avoided my eyes. That hurt more than Claire's coldness ever had. "You told me it was missing," I said quietly. Daniel exhaled hard. "We found it last week." Claire stepped from the conference room, carrying a coffee cup that smelled faintly of vanilla cream. "Margaret, nobody wanted to upset you while you were grieving." Grieving. They kept using that word like it explained blindness. I glanced toward the executive office windows overlooking the frozen loading yard where Ellis trucks lined up beside falling snow. Richard used to stand down there personally during storms, making sure drivers had hot coffee before overnight routes. He never trusted people who chased appearances before loyalty. Grant opened another folder across the table. "The company needs outside capital to remain competitive," he explained carefully. "Expansion into coastal shipping could triple annual revenue. Newport Harbor. Marina investors. Luxury partnerships." Suddenly, every strange detail connected together in my mind with quiet, terrifying clarity. Claire folded her arms. "Daniel is trying to secure the future." I finally looked directly at her. "With borrowed money?" The room went still. Grant adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Ellis, emotional attachment sometimes prevents necessary business evolution." I almost smiled at that. Emotional attachment. Richard and I mortgaged our first house twice to keep Ellis Transportation alive during the recession of 1991. We skipped vacations for 15 years. I clipped coupons while competitors bought yachts. Then I reached into my handbag slowly and placed a sealed envelope onto the conference table. Daniel frowned immediately when he saw Richard's handwriting across the front. "For Margaret only." His face lost color before I even opened it. Inside sat a notarized ownership transfer signed 11 years earlier. Richard had quietly transferred controlling shares of Ellis Transportation into my name long before his death. And nobody in that room knew it except me. For several long seconds, nobody in the conference room moved. Snow drifted outside the executive windows while the hum of the heating system filled the silence between us. Daniel stared at the ownership transfer papers like he no longer recognized the room around him. Claire's coffee cup slipped slightly against the glass table before she grabbed it again with trembling fingers. Grant Mercer recovered first. Men like him always did. He straightened his tie and offered a calm professional smile that suddenly looked much less convincing. "Mrs. Ellis," he said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss strategic options privately." I folded the documents back into the envelope. "There will be no coastal expansion deal." Claire inhaled sharply. "You cannot shut everything down because you are afraid of change." Her voice carried frustration now instead of polished restraint. I looked at her quietly. "Your father-in-law built this company without gambling borrowed money against it." Daniel finally spoke. "Mom, we already signed preliminary agreements." That sentence landed harder than the rest. Signed. Meaning the company was already tied to something dangerous. Grant slid another folder slowly across the table. "The financing package includes personal guarantees tied to future freight revenue." I opened the folder and immediately saw numbers Richard never would have accepted. Massive leveraged debt. Variable interest exposure. Luxury marina development partnerships hidden inside transportation restructuring language. Claire crossed her arms defensively. "This was supposed to modernize everything." "No," I answered softly. "It was supposed to impress people." Her face tightened instantly because she knew I was right. Outside the office windows, several Ellis trucks rolled slowly through the snowy loading yard below. Men Richard hired decades earlier still worked those routes. Families depended on those paychecks. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face before speaking again. "If we pull out now, the penalties alone could cripple the company." Grant remained calm, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "There is also a board meeting Friday morning." He paused deliberately. "Several investors already expect approval." There was at last. Pressure. Deadlines. Quiet intimidation wrapped in business language. I stood slowly from the conference table and slipped Richard's envelope back into my handbag. "Then I suggest the board learns who actually owns Ellis Transportation before Friday arrives." Daniel looked genuinely frightened for the first time in his life. Friday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Snow covered the Ellis Transportation loading yard in uneven drifts while executives filed quietly into the boardroom, carrying coffee cups and leather portfolios. I recognized most of them from years of company Christmas parties and retirement dinners. Men who once sat in my kitchen eating homemade pie while discussing diesel prices with Richard now avoided eye contact as I entered the room. Claire sat near the far end of the conference table wearing a cream wool suit with her posture perfectly controlled. But her hands stayed locked tightly together in her lap. Daniel looked exhausted. He had not shaved properly, and dark circles rested beneath his eyes. Grant Mercer stood near the projector screen reviewing financial slides filled with marina development projections and freight expansion charts. "Mrs. Ellis," one board member said cautiously, "we were not expecting you today." I removed my gloves slowly before sitting beside Richard's empty chair at the head of the table. That is becoming a pattern lately. Nobody smiled. Grant began speaking smoothly about modernization strategies and capital partnerships while polished graphs appeared across the screen. Every sentence sounded expensive. Every promise depended on borrowed money. I watched Daniel carefully instead of the presentation. He kept rubbing the same spot near his wedding ring whenever Grant mentioned investor deadlines. Guilt leaves habits behind. Finally, Grant clicked to the final slide showing projected ownership restructuring after refinancing approval. My name appeared in tiny letters near the bottom. Temporary non-executive shareholder. Claire noticed me staring at it. Her breathing changed slightly. You were going to remove me completely, I said quietly. No one answered immediately. Daniel finally leaned forward. Mom, it was supposed to protect the company from instability. Instability, I repeated softly. You mean me? The room tightened. Grant stepped in quickly. This is not personal. I opened Richard's envelope again and slid certified ownership documents across the polished table directly toward the board members. One older executive adjusted his glasses twice before looking back at me with visible shock. Silence spread through the room like a storm front. Then Daniel stood suddenly from his chair and looked directly at Grant Mercer. You told me she only owned ceremonial shares. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized my son had been manipulated too. The boardroom changed instantly after Daniel's words hit the table. Executives who had stayed politely silent moments earlier now began exchanging uneasy glances while Grant Mercer's confident posture tightened for the first time all morning. One older board member leaned forward, adjusting his glasses again as he reread Richard's ownership transfer. These documents appear fully binding, he said carefully. Another executive cleared his throat. Which means refinancing approval cannot legally proceed without Mrs. Ellis authorizing it personally. Grant kept his expression controlled, but the edges were slipping now. There are still pending contractual obligations, he argued smoothly. I looked directly at him. Contracts built on incomplete disclosure are not obligations. They are liabilities. The room went silent again. Claire stared down at the conference table with her jaw clenched tightly enough to show tension beneath her makeup. For the first time since Richard died, she looked less angry than frightened. Daniel slowly lowered himself back into his chair. How much debt are we actually talking about? He asked quietly. Grant hesitated half a second too long. One of the financial officers opened another folder and exhaled sharply. Good Lord. Several pages slid across the table, revealing marina partnership guarantees tied directly to Ellis transportation assets, including freight terminals and warehouse properties Richard spent decades paying off. Claire turned toward Grant immediately. You said the exposure was limited. It was manageable under expansion projections, Grant answered. But nobody sounded convinced anymore. Outside the boardroom windows, snow continued falling across the loading yard, while drivers prepared trucks for afternoon routes completely unaware how close the company had come to disaster. I thought about Richard standing out there during storms, making sure heaters worked inside every cab before drivers left overnight. Grant gathered his folders with forced calm. Perhaps emotions are clouding long-term vision here. Daniel looked up sharply. No. Trust clouded it. That sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Claire finally spoke again, but her voice sounded smaller now. Margaret, we were trying to grow something. I studied her quietly for several seconds. You were trying to outrun insecurity with borrowed status. Tears briefly filled her eyes before she looked away. Then the senior board member closed the refinancing binder firmly and announced the emergency vote would begin immediately. And suddenly Grant Mercer no longer controlled the room. The emergency vote ended just before sunset. By then the snow outside had stopped and pale orange lights stretched across the Ellis transportation yard where drivers finished loading the final overnight routes. Grant Mercer left the building without shaking anyone's hand. His refinancing proposal had been rejected unanimously, and several board members were already discussing legal reviews of the contracts he pushed through so aggressively. Claire remained seated long after the meeting ended, staring silently at the polished conference table while employees moved quietly through the hallway outside. Daniel stood near the windows with both hands in his coat pockets, watching the trucks leave one by one. He looked tired in a way sleep could not fix. "Dad knew," he said finally without turning around. "That is why he transferred the shares early." I nodded once. "Your father trusted people less after success arrived." Claire looked up slowly. Her makeup had faded slightly beneath exhausted eyes that no longer carried the sharp confidence she wore at country clubs and marina dinners. "I thought if we looked successful enough, people would finally respect us," she admitted softly. No one answered immediately. Sometimes honesty sounds lonelier than anger. A week later, the executive offices already felt different. The expensive marina proposals disappeared. Several long-delayed driver benefits were restored instead. Daniel began spending mornings in the freight yard again, talking directly with dispatch teams the way Richard once did. Claire stopped carrying designer handbags everywhere. One afternoon, she quietly sat beside me at the kitchen table while I clipped grocery coupons near the coffee pot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached for the scissors carefully. "You save almost $30 a week doing this?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Closer to 40. She laughed softly through embarrassed tears before lowering her eyes. Outside the window, an Ellis truck rolled down the snowy highway carrying the company logo Richard painted by hand decades ago. In the end, it was never really about money. It was about remembering who sacrificed quietly long before success arrived and who mistook appearances for strength. If this story stayed with you today, subscribe for more heartfelt stories about family loyalty, resilience, and second chances. And share your thoughts below, because sometimes wisdom speaks softly until life forces everyone to finally listen.